Now this and the appeal. I'm joined today by San Antonio Mayor Ron Nirenberg, who is joining us today to talk about the crisis of policing in San Antonio. And we only have a little bit of time, so I want to get into as much substance as possible. So let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you hear? Oh, you're muted.
Thanks for having me, Jess.
So 1 in 1,000 Black men are killed by police in America. And according to the American Journal of Public Health, 8% of men killed in the United States are killed by police. And people have been taking to the streets in the recent days across the country and the world, really, after the recent police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Rayshard Brooks, and too many more. You recently asked your police chief, William McManus, to explain police use of force standards to the public. And what he said was that police could use tear gas or rubber bullets to respond to demonstrators who use force against officers. But videos on social media are showing officers using tear gas and rubber bullets in response to destruction of property. And you yourself have said that you're not okay with the force used against San Antonio residents, some of whom were seriously injured. And the New York Times has reported on evidence that tear gas increases the likelihood of coronavirus infection and pandemic acceleration. So we're also facing that kind of simultaneous crisis at the same time. Do you support your police chief's statements, and would you ban use of tear gas compounds and rubber bullets?
Yeah, I don't agree with the use of these instruments in our community, particularly in demonstrations where there's a outpouring and demonstrations against the use of force. And as we've seen in too many cases, the use of rubber bullets, other projectiles, and chemical agents can have lethal effects, even if they're considered less than lethal. So we're going through use of force review right now with the entire city council and with the police department. And in the meantime, we have made a change in which any of those kinds of weapons cannot be used unless it's specifically directed by the police chief. So the accountability now is directly through the chief as we work through the use of force review.
I'm sorry.
Thank
you. San Antonio devotes about 40% of its general fund spending annually to policing. And that's over $500 million a year, kind of all included. Prior to the pandemic, your 2020 budget increased police spending relative to 2019 by 20 million, so about a 5% increase. And the $511 million in proposed spending is about 10 times more than the $52 million that you spend on health and housing, health, and human services. And your budget, as like many cities, is going to see an estimated shortfall in the coming months of hundreds of millions of dollars over even the next few years. But your proposed budget cuts tens of millions from non-police programs, but it doesn't really substantially attack police spending or impact police spending. And we're seeing from New York to Los Angeles to Dallas, other mayors are committing to freezing and even reducing police spending to increase investments in healthcare, housing, education, social services. Will you commit to reducing police spending in San Antonio?
So we're engaging that this Friday with the council. And one of the things I'll tell you is that it's a problem because we have defined public safety strictly through the lens of how we fund police departments. This is something that's happening in San Antonio. It's happening nationwide. And so what we're looking to do is rebalance that equation and look at what kinds of work our police department is doing that is not policing activity, and start to shift it to experts and others in social work that can be doing that in a more effective way. I will tell you that we're challenged here in San Antonio because of the fact that we have a collective bargaining agreement that has ballooned to the percentage that you talked about, almost 40% of the budget, that has in it 80%, more than 80% of police spending is locked within that CBA. So there is some significant work to do in terms of analyzing how we're spending our resources as a community related to keeping a healthy and safe community. But it also is going to require some long-term action to rebalance that equation.
So would you say that your goal is to reduce or at least freeze police spending in San Antonio? Obviously, it's a process and you
Yeah.
how it ends up, but is that your ultimate goal?
My goal is to change the way we're funding so that we're not reliant on the police department to create a healthy and safe community. It's not good for any of us when the police budget crowds out all of the other investments we make as a community. We end up reaping what we sow when we disinvest in services from libraries and parks to child nutrition and domestic violence prevention. Those are the victim to cuts when we were having to put more money obligated through these union agreements.
So I want to move on since we don't have a ton of time. Unlike some cities, San Antonio doesn't have, speaking of budgets, doesn't have a department devoted to violence prevention. And studies show that violence prevention programs work well, including in San Antonio. Violence interruption programs where community members who are directly impacted and credible messengers on issues related to violence identify and respond to potential conflict before it occurs. And these programs are obviously separate from policing as prevention, right? You spend around $1 million on various programs, but are you interested in creating a department of violence prevention and investing in violence interruption programs in particular?
Yeah, well, so the separate department issue hasn't come up, but we certainly are engaged now in a strategic plan for violence prevention. We have used a cure violence model here in the city. We used to be directly engaged with cure violence. But we have a health, community health plan that we're engaging now that's focusing specifically on trauma-informed care and a continuum of services that help us get in front of what we're ultimately having to police. That includes domestic violence prevention, getting to trauma-informed care to alleviate some of the ACEs, that adverse childhood experiences that are contributing to problems down the line, preventing child abuse and neglect in our community, and ultimately, making sure that we're investing in the services and infrastructure equitably across our city.
So you brought up police union contracts before, and I want to talk a little bit about the police union president. So the outgoing San Antonio police union president criticized your call for reforms to the city and your call for reforms to the police union contract. What he basically said was, you can have a wish list, but what you want isn't going to happen. And he also said that your use of the expletive "goddamn" was as offensive as an officer repeatedly using the N-word while arresting a Black man. So what is the impact of these police unions on police reform in San Antonio more broadly? And will you reject and work to convince others to reject campaign contributions from police unions, especially given your experience with the current president?
Absolutely. On that last part, I think that what we've seen here in San Antonio is that there have been members, and particularly the leadership of the police union, that has used political leverage to prevent us from making meaningful reforms, both on the financial side, but also in terms of disciplinary action. With regard to the comments he made defending the use of the N-word, I think people can very clearly see so first of all, to make that equivalency itself is obscene and absurd and offensive to our entire community, which is a majority minority community, by the way. And so, that's what we're up against. If he can quickly dismiss an agenda of reform that is being echoed in every corner of every city in America, it shows a level of disinterest in community that should concern everybody who is dependent on their services.
And does that lend more credence to the idea that what we should actually be focused on is reducing funding, right? When we have such entrenched kind of cultural issues coming from the police union president. I understand he's outgoing, but that rhetoric coming from the guy who's has some control over how reforms are implemented and what reforms are going to happen. Does that lend more credence to the answer here being about defunding or reducing funding in San Antonio?
I think it lends credence to the idea that we have systematically disinvested in our communities as a result of these police budgets ballooning and us putting more responsibility in the police departments for doing work that is social work and health prevention and wellness work. And if we rely on our police department to do all of that, we are going to systematically see the effects of that disinvestment. Mm-hmm. And so to couple that with the challenge presented by a union contract that locks out the city council and public accountability from the use of those resources, it makes it doubly hard to change things. And I would say that the union contract in San Antonio has been made exponentially more difficult because of the provisions within it that further enhance or that further detract from transparency and accountability, and bind future city councils to the provisions through the use of an evergreen clause that lasts for 8 years. Mm-hmm. It's been a deterrent to negotiation with public officials and for community accountability, and it has to end. And that's why people are in the streets. That they understand that without accountability on the part of the people they put into office, whose hands are largely bound by these contracts, they're not going to get anywhere, and they're frustrated with it. And we have to recognize that and in some ways embrace that, because that frustration only grows the more we don't address it. And that's what I've said we have to do in this next contract negotiation, is finally build in the accountability that people are seeking.
So in Louisville, Kentucky, the city council recently passed Breonna's Law, which bans these military-style no-knock raids like the ones that killed Breonna Taylor. And these no-knock or quick knock, forced entry, and police, these forced entry raids and these police militarization more broadly have contributed to the 1,000+ police killings of civilians every year that we see in this country. Would you support passing a similar law in San Antonio that would ban no-knock raids, restrict these quick knock raids, and really work to demilitarize the police in San Antonio?
I would, and I've discussed it with some of the members of the council as well about that. No-knock warrants are some of the most dangerous processes that the public or the police can go through, and I would be supportive of that.
Great, thank you, Mayor. I have just a couple more questions for you. So I want to talk about first responders and how we think about first responding as a role of the police. So polling from the Justice Collaborative Institute, along with Data for Progress, shows that 9 in 10 voters support creating an agency that would shift a lot of the first responder responsibilities away from traditional law enforcement and toward medical professionals, social workers. So San Antonio has a crisis response team that includes police and mental health experts, but similar setups elsewhere have led to problems and calls for a very specific first responder unit with mental health experts, with social workers that's separate from law enforcement. And Austin will now have this option, right, for health service first responders who can call for police help as needed, but are separate from law enforcement. Are you willing to consider a first responder system that is not connected to law enforcement?
I am, and I like that evolution of thought, because when we first started the health response teams, which are essentially mental health trained police officers, we've gotten a great response from that. However, that process of responding to health crises with health experts is really what we have to focus on. There is a level of escalation that doesn't need to occur when we send somebody there who's armed. And so I would support that. And I look forward to having the start of that discussion with the council this week.
That's great. Thank you. And then I want to talk to you just briefly about housing in San Antonio. Vacant and dilapidated housing is a major issue in your city. News for San Antonio reported there were 100,000 code enforcement cases last year alone. And you've reduced the population of people experiencing homelessness by 6% since 2018. But there are still around 3,000 people estimated to be experiencing homelessness in San Antonio as of January of this year. And that was pre-pandemic, right? So many more expected after the pandemic's impact on the economy, on jobs. Do you support allocating additional city funds to community land trusts, dilapidated property improvement efforts, for the purchase, the renovation of vacant or dilapidated homes to provide more permanent mixed income housing for people in San Antonio? And if you do you know how much funds you're willing to allocate to these efforts?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So when I became mayor in 2017, one of the first things I did was form a group to come up with, in the public, the city's first ever comprehensive and compassionate housing policy, which was ratified by council in 2018. We've been fully funding that plan with the city since then. And so housing has been from the start of my tenure here, one of our top priorities, because, it's not improving nationwide and too many of our citizens are cost burdened by housing. So I do support community land trusts. I do support additional housing, additional resources into affordable housing. It's one of those things that we are leaving by the wayside when we overfund other departments. And so we are in year 2 now, or we're ending year 2 of a 10-year housing program that I believe is about $1.3 billion. It's going to require us to pass some bonds and also change our charter, in some case work with the legislature to do so. To allow for these kinds of transactions. We're limited by our city charter in terms of how we can use those dollars. But I think it's pretty clear. The more we can improve our housing situation by mixed use, available housing in all corners of our city, the better off our citizens will be. And that goes right to our level of poverty that we're struggling with.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Mayor Ron Nirenberg from San Antonio. We really appreciate you taking the time, and we know you're busy, so thank you so much.
Thanks, Josie.
Thanks for joining us today on The Briefing. Please tune in again tomorrow at 12:30 Eastern as we discuss the Peace Act with Representative Ro Khanna. And thank you so much.